One question that has gone over in my mind, from time to time is the phenomenon of people being, for lack of a better term, being weebs. People, weeaboos, people who identify more with Japanese culture, or at least the view of Japanese culture that we get from popular media, than they do with their own Western society. And, all jokes aside, attempting to really understand why this happens, I think a great deal of it really has to do with alienation. I mean, it should not really come as a surprise that alienation would be a reason why someone would look outside their own culture to look for something else. I mean, capitalism is alienating. That's pretty much the point of it. That's what it's supposed to do. And that's the only thing that it can do. And that is alienate people away from it, alienate people away from each other. And when this happens, people are going to look for a way to connect with other people because that is what human beings do. Human beings are social creatures that that do seek out meaningful connections with other people. And given how alienating Western capitalist society is, it should be no surprise that people are looking elsewhere for that when they're not getting it from here. And it should notice that the further along we develop, the more capitalistic that we become, the worse that alienation becomes. And the more varied people become, the worse that is going to be, which is why subcultures are such a huge thing in Western capitalist countries and not so much in other non-Western places or places that aren't as developed along capitalist lines, which is why subcultures were basically almost unheard of in the Soviet Union. There actually were punks in the Soviet Union, and they weren't against socialism per se, but they were against a lot of the sort of revisionism that came up. But regardless, the tendency to idealize Japanese culture uh, is one that it exists because of alienation itself, and it tends to be idealized from popular media, particularly anime, that doesn't portray it as accurately as it actually exists because that's the nature of media. Media doesn't always really give us an accurate representation, particularly with regards to any kind of media that's intended to be entertainment. But nonetheless, people in the West are looking outside their own culture, particularly the younger people, as alienation is getting worse. And it's not surprising to see people attracted to the Japanese culture. Because in psychology, there's a concept known as individualist versus collectivized societies. Now, this is not the same way that in political economy that you would use the terms collectivist and individualist. It's used in a very different manner. For example, Japan is still very capitalist, very, very capitalist, but it is still more collectivist in a psychological sense, meaning when people act, they do think about other people or how it would affect other people or how it would be seen by other people in general, which is why you still have a very conservative social situation where you just don't make noise on the bus or the public transportation in general, which is why you don't do outlandish things, why you don't express anger publicly. Whereas in a very individualist, psychologically speaking, society like the United States or the West in general, that's perfectly okay and in fact encouraged to express anger publicly. So just to preface that, saying that these are two different concepts of individualist versus collectivist. Collectivist, in the psychological sense, means ones that places more emphasis on how one is perceived by the whole or how one's actions affect the whole, rather than a very individualist where it's the opposite of that. which is not necessarily the same thing as being collectivist or individualist in an economic sense. The prevailing Western ideology today is incredibly alienating and pushes people into subcultures, which is why subcultures are now bigger now than they've probably have been in any time in Western history. It is people looking out to other cultures to be a part of. The one thing is that the Japanese culture is very collectivist rather than individualist. There is that concern for other people or how one's actions affect a group. And when one is alienated and looking for connections to other people, that's something they're going to be looking for. That is something that is going to be noticed and picked up upon by people who feel alienated. And the whole focus is not necessarily the same as it is here. It means a greater focus on one's role in society and how it affects others. This is very different from the hyper individualistic way that we in Western society behave. And because of that element of showing more concern for how you affect other people, to be more collectivist in that way, that's going to attract people that are feeling alienated. Now, that's not entirely accurately represented by anime, which tends to be the part that people are particularly attracted to, which really isn't surprising because it's a form of media and it's a form of entertainment media. If anything was going to make that attraction, it was going to be entertainment media anyway. So it's not so much that there's anything particularly unique to anime in this regard, but the fact that it is entertainment and it does portray things in a certain way that people kind of do want to see, or people they do want to feel and experience in that regard. Now, this is still not an accurate representation. There's still very much about Japanese society that is very alienating, that is still very damaging. The social taboo around suicide and not confronting the issue, the work yourself to death kind of culture, and the way that like an employer has a disproportionate amount of control over your life, etc. But these are things that you don't experience when you kind of idolize that culture, or when you're looking for that alternate culture to be a part of. That's not something that's particularly stressed all that much in anime, so that tends to get overlooked. The real issue here tends to be that people are alienated away from the society that they are a part of and are looking for a substitute culture, a substitute society to be a part of. And given the way that anime portrays Japanese society, it's not unreasonable for someone to kind of become attracted towards that. So I would understand that's why it happens. So this is basically my opinion of why I think the weeaboo culture takes off the way that it does. I mean, if you do look at the way weeaboos or that kind of person is particularly portrayed, and if you go to an anime convention or you see the kind of person that is a person who is suffering from alienation, one way or another, they're suffering from alienation. They are marginalized from society to some degree or another, and this is where they find that connection with other people. I mean, this isn't tremendously too much different than what you would find from juggalos. I mean, it's as much of a joke that you can make, magnets and all that. I mean, what really is a juggalo but someone who is marginalized away from society and then finds a new family, a new fam, a new connection with other people inside of a culture that is more accepting and is more social in general. One that is more collectivized in that psychological sense that they do accept each other and they are concerned about each other, and they happen to have this shared appreciation for the music, style, aesthetic, whatever, of Insane Clown Posse. So it's not unsurprising that these things would form, and they don't just take the form of anime. They can take the form of, being a juggalo or being a part of any other kind of subculture, each of them having their own particular distinctions. For like the punk culture of previous generations, and my own, and the one before me, having a very heavily anti-capitalist tone, having reached its largest peak in the 1980s during the Reagan era, etc., and all of that. So it is understandable. So that is to say that being a weeb isn't necessarily in itself a bad thing, but it is the symptom of a problem that's not being addressed within society itself, and that is the very alienating nature of it. Now, it should be noted that one of the groups that tends not to really feel that way is the evangelical Christian community, because they tend to accept, as long as you say that you're evangelical Christian and you go along with their particular version of what Christianity is, no matter how horrid that may be, you're considered one of the group, and why there does tend to be a little bit less alienation when it comes to religious groups. For example, subcultures among Islamic societies, or predominantly Islamic societies, aren't that common for that same reason, because they still have that kind of a collectivist, psychological togetherness that you would get from religion. I'm not necessarily saying religion is a good way to do it, or anything like that. I'm just saying that it is. I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm saying that it is, which is why you tend to also see them in a kind of a less religious structure, which doesn't necessarily make a religious structure good or bad. It just merely says that it is. So I think that it demonstrates that being a weeb or a juggalo in itself is not a bad thing, but it is a symptom of something that isn't working, of something that isn't being portrayed properly, that isn't functioning properly, and that is society itself, generally that being the more modern capitalist society. And when you have a society that alienates, you're going to have people that are going to look for another society that's going to make up for it. Thank you for watching. If you like this program, then please head over to my Patreon page and set up a monthly donation. It's your donations that keep this program running. Also, if you would like, please rate, comment, subscribe, and share in various social media.